Driving a hearse isn't glamorous. It's not a job that demands attention or praise, but it does come with a certain weight. Over time, you get used to the routine, the checklists, the routes, the calls, the loading, especially the loading. There's a rhythm to it, a kind of quiet precision. It doesn't need to be flashy, it just needs to be reliable. Main to Clearwater, then up toward Westfield Memorial. I heard the click, pulled on it to test it, and it locked. Got back in, drove 5 more minutes, and then it happened again. Couldn't sleep with the closet door closed. Wouldn't ride in elevators. Wouldn't even shut the bathroom door all the way. She felt like the walls were closing in. She gave a nervous laugh, the kind that comes out when grief makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise. I told her that she wouldn't even know, not after passing, but still. She made me promise to tell someone, just in case. I nodded again, but this time slower, my mind wandering back to that latch. 3 times that door had never popped open before, and it hasn't since. I stopped, checked it again. I ran through all the possible explanations. Maybe it was heat expansion. Maybe something had snagged on the inside during loading. I ran through those possibilities and called the funeral home just to double, but everything seemed fine. The family hadn't moved anything, and the casket hadn't shifted. I rechecked everything one more time. I went over my usual checklist, cleared the lock, reset the seal, even tied a backup strap just as a secondary measure. That door didn't move an inch after that. It held solid for the rest of the journey. I know which turns are sharp, where the potholes are, when to brake, and when to slow. One of the sons, middle-aged, polite but visibly strained, approached me to thank me for being on time. I gave a short nod and moved to prepare the offloading with the assistance of the grounds crew. Then, the daughter approached. It was her voice that caught my attention, soft, just above a whisper. "I hate enclosed spaces," she said. "I've driven this route hundreds, maybe thousands of times. So, when I felt that subtle slide, just a shift, like something wasn't fully secured, they pulled off immediately. I stepped out, walked around back, and sure enough, the latch had popped open. My heart didn't race. I didn't panic. The door wasn't open, but it wasn't fully sealed either. I stood there for a second, just staring. But I felt that small sting of disbelief. It shouldn't have happened. It never had before. You get used to the silence, to the weight of what you carry, and you get good at it. This was about 5 years ago, in the early spring. The trees were still bare, but the sun had begun to linger longer each day. We had a midday service for a woman in her early 60s. There was just enough time for everyone to prepare, but not enough to fully accept what was happening. I won't name the family, of course, but she was well loved, and she passed from complications after a long illness. The day started like any other. The casket had been delivered the night before. The family had selected a simple maple finish, no excessive ornamentation, just tasteful, which fit her perfectly. She had asked for modesty in everything, her daughter told me. She didn't want to be fussed over. I kept my tone steady, my movements slow and deliberate, with no rush, just calm, respectful, and reliable. I went through my usual pre-departure checks. Tires, fuel, interior. I always make sure the latch is fully secured before leaving the funeral home. So I did the usual. Inspect it manually, press it down, double-check the lock. Indicator. Never had an issue before. She had this fear her whole life, she explained. But halfway to the cemetery I felt it a shift. I know the roads on that route. I closed the door again firm. When we arrived, the family was already gathered at the graveside. I looked at her, not quite understanding. It's not uncommon for people to show up unannounced to funerals. Sometimes distant friends, long-lost neighbors, or others who have a personal connection but weren't noted on the family's list. As the service went on, I made sure to keep my distance. One of the sons was walking back toward the cars. But I noticed the woman again this time. She was moving, walking directly behind the family procession, still barefoot, still in black. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. She wasn't in a rush, just quietly walking behind us, like she belonged there. I stayed out of the way, but close enough to respond if needed. I could feel the tension in my chest growing, but I didn't want to make a scene. But when I turned around to look for the woman, she was gone. Not a trace. No footprints in the frost, nothing, everything was in order. No unusual movements, no sounds, just the quiet hum of the engine and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But the next day, I couldn't help myself. I took a look at the cemetery records, just to see if anything stood out. That's when I noticed the Namalina bent. I couldn't get her out of my mind. There had been no sign of her leaving, no sign of her ever being there. I even checked the security footage of the cemetery office to satisfy my curiosity. I couldn't explain it, but her grave felt ... different. It felt as though something had been left undone. Nothing. No woman in black. No record of anyone walking near the entrance or leaving the premises. After all, this was a solemn occasion, and my role was to remain professional. Still, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't right. She hadn't been on the list, and yet she was there, walking behind the family. There was no ceremony, no family, just a direct burial. I checked the records again, but there was nothing more about her. No obituary, no funeral. Just a simple, quiet burial with a temporary marker. It felt wrong, like an intrusion, like she was a shadow that didn't belong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was ... off. I've seen plenty of odd things during my years in this job, but what caught my attention was that nobody had noticed her. I asked another member of the crew, but they had no idea who I was talking about. No one had seen it. I went back to check the family list to make sure there were no additional mourners, but everything was in order. No extra names. I kept an eye on the woman, watching her from the corner of my eye as she remained perfectly still, never moving. Nobody turned to look. It was as if she wasn't even there. But what struck me about this woman was the way no one else seemed to notice her. Not a single glance from the family. I finished checking in with the funeral director and began the preparations for the casket to be carried to the gravesite. When the service ended, I watched as the family began to leave. I radioed one of the attendants and asked if he had seen the woman. His response was quick. What woman? I wasn't rattled, at least, not outwardly. The woman continued to follow behind the procession. After the last of the family had left, I walked back toward the hearse, planning to perform my final checks. I walked to the back of the hearse and ran a quick check on the vehicle. I returned to the office, but I didn't ask the staff about the woman. There was no point. They hadn't seen her either. The unmarked grave was right next to Clarice Benton's plot, just a row over. Eleanor had been buried there the year before. Something about Eleanor Benton's story didn't sit right with me. Driving a hearse is one of those jobs you never really talk about. It's not the kind of thing that gets discussed over dinner or mentioned at parties. I've driven thousands of funerals, carried caskets of all shapes and sizes, from simple pine boxes to the most extravagant, gold-trimed creations. But the real stories, the ones that get under your skin, are not about the dead. The sun was bright, the air still, and everything seemed calm. The funeral director was already outside, waiting, clipboard in hand, directing traffic. He was too still, too silent, and too far removed from the grieving family. I tried to brush it off, but as I loaded the casket into the hearse, I noticed the man was still there, watching. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him behind us, following the procession, but he never appeared. Still, that feeling didn't go away. The air in the hearse was thick, and the radio, usually a small comfort on these long drives, seemed eerily silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the tires humming against the asphalt. I even made a mental note to ask the funeral director if he knew who he was. But when I turned back, he was gone. I returned to the family and finished unloading the casket. I stayed behind, walking to the back of the hearse to double-check everything. That's when I noticed something strange. The grounds were undisturbed. The man in the military jacket had disappeared again. The back door of the hearse, the one that had been securely latched earlier, was now slightly ajar. I approached it, slowly. The latch wasn't broken, but it was loose. The casket inside was secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been tampered with. The service was brief and quiet, the way most funeral services are. The family said their goodbyes, and everything felt final, like the end of a chapter. No trace. I walked up to him and asked, "Can I help you?" What was he doing there? Was he a ghost, a manifestation of grief, or just a figment of my imagination? Maybe he had a connection to Roger Burns that no one knew about. But I've been doing this long enough to know that sometimes things happen that can't be explained. He hadn't been there long enough to leave, but he was just gone. The family was gathered, quiet, their grief heavy in the air. The silence felt too thick, and the weight of the moment lingered longer than it should have. They read about the things that happen when the body isn't the only thing being carried, but after doing it for as long as I have, you start to notice things, strange things. And that's when I saw him again, the man in the military jacket. This time, he was standing by the freshly dug grave, just watching, disappearing into the trees at the edge of the cemetery. The family hadn't seen him, nor had the staff. It was like he was invisible to everyone but me. I asked one of the cemetery attendants if he had seen the man, but he just shook his head, confused. The staff had already prepared the gravesite. The sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the gravestones. It was a peaceful scene, but there was still that nagging feeling, the kind of weather that could trick you into believing everything in the world was just fine. We had a service scheduled for a man named Roger Burns. He was 72, a veteran of the Vietnam War, and passed away in his sleep after a long illness. The family was small, but close-knit, to wife, 2 grown children, and a few grandchildren. It wasn't an unusual service, but there was something strange about that day that I couldn't shake. It's easy to dismiss the odd occurrences here and there when you're busy keeping things running smoothly. After all, the work itself isn't glamorous, it's just routine. But the truth is, the job comes with an unsettling set of experiences that no one prepares you for. I've been a hearse driver for over 18 years. A few years ago, I was working in a small town cemetery just outside of Cincinnati. It was a beautiful spring day. I remember pulling up to the funeral home just before the procession was to begin. The service went smoothly. The eulogy was touching, but nothing out of the ordinary. What struck me, however, was the moment after the casket was placed in the hearse. As I was securing the back door, something caught my eye. A man standing off in the distance. He wasn't with the family, and I hadn't seen him before. He was just standing there, at the edge of the cemetery, wearing a faded military jacket. His posture was rigid, almost unnatural, and his eyes were fixed on the casket in the hearse. I don't know what made me look at him so intently, but something about him felt off. I've chalked it up to an odd coincidence after all. People often visit cemeteries for various reasons, but that moment stayed with me. As we made our way to the cemetery, the unsettling feeling in my chest didn't fade. We arrived at the cemetery just as the last of the family's cars pulled in. The grounds were peaceful, as always. I parked the hearse, stepped out, and began walking towards the back to help offload the casket. This time, I didn't wait to see if he would disappear. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the casket. And then, without a word, he turned and walked away. By now I was seriously unsettled, but I did my best to maintain composure. After the last words were spoken and the crowd started to thin out, I checked the area, but there was no sign of anyone having been near the vehicle. No footprints in the dirt, no lingering shadows. I never told the family about the man or the strange occurrences. They had enough to deal with, but I kept wondering, who was he? The rest of the day unfolded without incident, but that lingering feeling of unease never quite left. After the service, I drove back to the funeral home, parked the hearse, and started the usual paperwork. But something about that day felt different. An older gentleman who had passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack. He was in his late 70s, and his family was small, 2 daughters and a son. It was another routine service, but as I stood at the gravesite, ready to unload the casket, I felt that familiar, uncomfortable chill, as though something had been left unresolved. I noticed something strange there, at the edge of the cemetery. Standing in the same spot as the man from before was the same figure. The military jacket, the stance, everything. He was watching. I pressed on the door again, and this time, it clicked shut. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the vehicle, the weight of the strange events pressing on me. I looked back at the family, still gathered at the gravesite. He had served during the Vietnam War. And why was the latch malfunctioning again? Was it the same force at play, or was it something new? But the records were quiet. She was in her late 50s, and though her passing was sudden, there was a sense of closure among the family. But as I waited for the family to board, I caught sight of something in the distance, something I'd hoped never to see again. The same man in the military jacket was standing by the entrance of the cemetery, staring directly at me. Like the man was still there, standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to appear again. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see him standing there, watching me drive away. The air grew heavy again, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. They had expected it, and the service was small and quiet. I arrived early, as always, and prepared the hearse, but as I checked the casket, I felt a strange twinge of familiarity. This time, there was no malfunction. I couldn't help but wonder if it was somehow connected to the way I felt that day, or if it had been something I couldn't see. Something in the air, in the ground, or in the very act of carrying the dead. The latch on the door seemed to resist a bit more than usual, and when I closed it, the sound of the click felt too soft, like something was holding it back, listing only the basic service dates, discharge information, and nothing more. No medals, no mentions of dishonorable discharge, just a quiet, normal service record. Nothing that suggested his spirit would be restless. I looked back at the cemetery, but the man was gone, vanished, like smoke in the wind. They were oblivious to everything, caught up in their own grief. But I wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The woman in the military jacket, the mysterious figure at the cemetery, and the loose latch had all weighed heavily on my mind. No man in the jacket, no unexplainable incidents. Everything seemed normal. Yet, deep down I knew that something was waiting. Something unseen, just beyond the edge of reality. A manifestation of grief or memory. I couldn't be sure. All I knew was that he had been there, twice, now, watching. And each time, he disappeared without a trace. That night, I tried to shake it off. I even told myself that I was overthinking things. I couldn't resist the urge to look back. The latch on the hearse door had popped open again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The casket had shifted slightly, and tested it. It was secure, but I couldn't shake the thought that the man in the military jacket had something to do with it. Was he trying to send me a message? Was I meant to understand something? Or was this all just coincidence? Just enough to make the door come loose. But this wasn't the first time this had happened. I was halfway down the road when I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was again, standing at the entrance of the cemetery, staring at the hearse as I drove away. My hands tightened on the wheel, my breath shallow. He didn't move, just stood there, his figure growing smaller and smaller as I drove away. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was the stress of the job catching up with me, but the questions kept gnawing at me, and I couldn't quite let go of the feeling that something wasn't right. A few weeks later, I was called to handle a service for a man named Thomas Archer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. I closed it and checked the latch, but something was different this time. The door didn't latch with its usual firmness. It was as if something or someone was pushing back from the inside. No one had seen him, not the family, not the staff. It was as if he had never been there at all. This time, I wasn't going to let it go. I turned and walked briskly toward him. I felt a strange pull in my chest, as though something beyond my control was guiding me. But as I got closer, the man disappeared, vanished without a trace. Just before I opened the back door of the hearse, I couldn't breathe. I glanced around the cemetery, looking for any sign of him. I checked the rear door of the hearse again, but this time, I couldn't help myself. I knew what I had to do. My heart raced. The service continued as expected, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the jacket. Was he real? Was he a ghost? After the burial, as I was leaving the cemetery, it wasn't until I arrived back at the funeral home that I saw it. I quickly checked the rear compartment again, double-checked the latch. I reviewed the records when I got home that night, checking Thomas Archer's military service. There was nothing particularly out of the ordinary, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like there was something I was missing. Why had he appeared during Thomas's burial? The next week I was called to handle another service, this time for a local woman named Charlotte Dorsey. I pulled the car around to the front of the church, ready for the procession to begin. I quickly turned to the funeral director and asked if anyone else had seen him. He gave me a puzzled look and said no. But this time, the latch stayed secure. As I drove to the cemetery, I felt like I was being watched, but when I arrived at the cemetery, the air felt still again. Driving a hearse is a strange job. It is not something you will ever see advertised on a billboard or hear about in casual conversation. Most people don't think about the hearse driver, the person behind the wheel, silently guiding the procession to its final resting place. She had passed away after a long illness, and her family requested a quiet, modest ceremony. I arrived early to prepare the hearse, as I always do. The air was thick with fog, and the sun hadn't quite broken through the mist, casting everything in a dull, grey hue. It felt like the day was already heavy with the weight of what was to come. The funeral director came over to assist me with unloading the casket, and that's when I noticed her. She was dressed in all black, her long hair cascading down her back, obscuring most of her face. So I went about my business, unloading the casket and helping the family with the service. But the woman in black remained in my peripheral vision, unmoving, silent. As the service ended and the family began to leave, I glanced toward the woman again, but she was gone. No footsteps, no trace of her. She had just vanished. But as I stepped out of the vehicle, there was something unsettling about his stillness. What was the point? It was probably just another strange coincidence, a trick of the mind. But as I moved through the rest of the service, I couldn't stop glancing around, expecting to see that man again, waiting, watching. The way he didn't seem to acknowledge the world around him. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. I turned my attention back to the family, began unloading the casket, and tried to focus on the task at hand. But when I looked back, the man was gone. Not a trace, just like the woman before him. I noticed something, or rather, someone standing by the gates of the cemetery. It was a man, wearing a long coat, his back turned to me. He stood there motionless, staring out into the distance. He was an older man, someone who had seen everything in this business, and his calm demeanor usually put me at ease. But today, he looked concerned. I thought nothing of it at first, thinking he was just a passerby. But as I approached, I saw that he was standing directly in front of the unmarked graves where the woman had been the week before. Her presence was almost ethereal, like she was made from the shadows themselves. It was probably just some eccentric visitor, or perhaps a local who had come to pay their respects. But something about her presence felt wrong. The unsettling feeling never quite left me, and I went about my duties. But I couldn't ignore the sense of dread that hung in the air. What caught my attention wasn't just her strange, quiet demeanor, but the fact that no one else seemed to notice her. The family was busy with their own grief, and the staff were focused on their work. But this woman, standing there, watching, was completely alone. But there's a reason why I've been doing it for nearly 15 years. The service was standard family gathered, whispered goodbyes, a few tears, and after the casket was placed into the hearse, I was called to a small funeral for a man named Joseph Turner. He was in his early 50s, passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack. The service was small, just a few close family members. Nothing out of the ordinary. Or so I thought. We began our journey to the cemetery. It was a small, local cemetery, nestled on the outskirts of town. Nothing out of the ordinary. The route to the cemetery was the same as always, but today, the road seemed to stretch longer, the fog thicker. It felt like the world was pressing in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me at the cemetery. The drive was routine, and I began to feel that familiar, quiet calm that comes with the job. It is not because it is easy or glamorous. The air outside was still, but there was a palpable tension in the cabin. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something out of place, but the road behind me was empty, save for the family vehicles following closely behind. Still, the feeling lingered, because you get to witness things that most people can see. I had driven this route countless times before, but that day, the drive felt slower, the silence more profound. The sun had finally begun to peek through the mist, but something about the way it cast shadows across the road gave me a sense of unease. I dismissed it as nerves, but as I turned into the cemetery gates, I felt a chill creep down my spine. Explain, and once you're in the business long enough, the strange becomes normal, but not everything can be explained. It was a dreary Tuesday when I was called to handle a routine service for an elderly woman, Mrs. Wilkins. I checked the casket and went through my usual pre-departure checks: tires, fuel, and ensuring the rear compartment was secured. The latches clicked shut without issue, but as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I neared the cemetery, the road seemed to stretch on longer than usual. I parked the hearse at the designated spot, and the family began to gather around the gravesite. Standing at the far end of the cemetery, near a row of unmarked graves, was a woman. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I shook my head, trying to push the thought out of my mind. It wasn't until the next week that I would experience something even more unsettling. As I was driving to the cemetery, I felt that familiar unease creeping in again. When I arrived, I parked the hearse in its usual spot. The family was already gathered at the graveside. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I didn't mention it to anyone. After the service, as I was preparing to leave, the funeral director approached me. Driving a hearse is not a job most people think about. It's a quiet profession, one that goes unnoticed to most of society. You don't have a flashy uniform or get any recognition. You simply drive, transport, and do the job with a level of precision and professionalism. But if you've been doing it as long as I have, you start to notice things you can't quite explain. Strange things. A woman dressed all in black, her long hair covering most of her face. There was something unsettling about the way she stood. She wasn't part of the funeral, none of the family knew who she was, and no one had invited her. The family was grieving, as expected, but there was nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But as I finished the offloading and helped the family to their cars, I saw her again. This time, she was walking behind the procession. She wasn't rushing, but she was following us, step by step. The unsettling part was that she wasn't making any noise, but the woman in black was nowhere to be found. I rushed around the cemetery grounds, checking every corner, but she was gone, talking to the groundskeepers, trying to make sense of it all. After a sudden and mysterious disappearance, the records showed that she had been a young woman, married, with no children. Her death had been ruled as a tragic accident, but no one had ever claimed her body, and she was buried without ceremony. The staff mentioned that they had always suspected something was off with her burial, but there had never been any concrete proof. I couldn't bring myself to mention her to the family, but I asked the staff if they had seen anyone strange lately. They hadn't, but they did mention something unsettling. There had been other reports of a woman in black showing up at gravesites over the years. They all described her the same way, tall, thin, wearing black, with long, dark hair that covered her face, and always alone. No footprints, no sign that she had ever been there. See if there was anything I missed. When I looked through the documents, one name jumped out at me: Sarah Whitaker. The air felt heavy, as though something had passed by, leaving only a lingering chill behind. Not a single footstep, no rustling of clothing, just the sound of the wind. My mind kept going back to that woman in black, and the strange feeling I had when she disappeared. It wasn't just the odd laugh I had heard. It was the fact that I hadn't seen her leave. There were no signs of her, no footprints in the dirt, no trace of where she might have gone. It felt as if she had just melted into the air. Yet, there she was, standing still as a statue, watching me. They hadn't seen anyone, and they certainly didn't recognize her. I radioed the staff, but no one had seen the woman either. It was like she had appeared out of nowhere, but she was always just behind us, always at the edge of my vision, as if she was silently watching, waiting for something. And when they happen over and over again, it becomes impossible to ignore. The cemetery staff was wrapping up, and I went to check the hearse one last time. A soft, distant laugh. It was barely audible at first, but it grew louder. A woman's laugh, a haunting laugh. I hadn't realized it before, but the latch on the back door was slightly ajar. I knew I had secured it before, but there it was, half open. I pulled it closed again, making sure the latch clicked into place, and started to walk toward the staff. I've been a hearse driver for almost 20 years now. It started as a simple job, one that seemed as routine as any other. I drive people to their final resting places, no questions asked. His family was small, just his wife, his daughter, and a few close friends. They weren't expecting anything grand for the ceremony, just a small, quiet affair. The funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m., and I showed up at 1:30, just like I always do. I show up, pick up the deceased, and drive them to the cemetery. It's a job where you're the invisible man there to serve, but never seen or heard. But I've learned over the years that things are rarely as simple as they seem. It all started with the service for a man named Daniel Morris. He passed unexpectedly from a heart attack. The weather that day was typical for early fall, a crisp breeze and overcast skies that made everything seem a little darker than usual. I parked the hearse by the curb, as I always do, and went inside to confirm the details with the funeral director. Everything seemed fine. Nothing was out of place. But when I stepped outside to load the casket, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the cemetery, near the large oak tree, staring directly at me. I tried to shake it off. People sometimes wander into cemeteries, I thought. Maybe she was just a passerby who had come to visit a loved one's grave. But something about the way she didn't move didn't speak, didn't acknowledge anyone else, left me uneasy. I went about my duties, unloaded the casket, and assisted the family. But every time I glanced toward the cemetery, I saw her standing there. The service went smoothly. I asked one of the family members if they knew her, but they looked at me like I was crazy. As the last of the family left, I stayed behind to make sure everything was in order. But that's when I heard it. I spun around. The next day, I went back to the cemetery, determined to find out what was going on. I spent the morning walking around the cemetery. I couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that something more was at play here. I decided to check the records of the cemetery. Sarah Whitaker was buried in an unmarked grave near the cemetery entrance, the only one left unaccounted for. She had died in 1923. I had to know more. I went to the local library, hoping to find a news article or any other information on Sarah Whitaker's life and death. As I pored over the old papers, I found a mention of her in a local newspaper, dated back to 1923. The article was vague, but it mentioned that Sarah had been involved in a car accident on a lonely stretch of road near the cemetery. The article didn't say much else, except that her body was never properly identified until weeks after her death. Her husband had disappeared not long after the accident. I noticed the ground beneath her feet, the soil was disturbed. It was as though something had recently been dug up. Beneath the soil, I found a small wooden box. The box was old, the wood warped with age, but there was something about it, something that didn't feel right. I opened it carefully, not knowing what to expect. He's gone, and I'm left here, trapped. The ritual was never completed. I can feel them now. Watching, waiting. I must return. I must finish what was started. I walked closer, and as I did, I felt the temperature drop. The air grew heavier, colder, but as I flipped through its pages, I couldn't believe what I was reading. The journal belonged to Sarah Whitaker. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the quiet rustle of leaves. But as I turned back to the grave, I noticed something even stranger. The soil around Sarah's grave had shifted. It was as though it had been disturbed, like something or someone had been buried again. It described her life, her marriage, and most chillingly, her involvement in a ritual that had gone terribly wrong. This was the same woman, the same figure I had seen, standing by the graves. But what was it that she was waiting for? Why had she appeared at these funerals? Why had she been following me? And why did I feel like she was still there, in the shadows, watching me as I read her words? And no one had ever figured out exactly what happened to him. The article also hinted at something even stranger. There were rumors that Sarah had been involved in a ritualistic cult, though this was never proven. Local gossip suggested that her death wasn't an accident, but a sacrifice. A sacrifice to what? To whom? The details were fuzzy, determined to find out if there was any connection between Sarah Whitaker and the woman I had seen. I walked down the path where her grave was located, and as I passed the row of unmarked graves, I felt the air shift again. I stood up, my legs weak, my mind racing. I didn't want to stay any longer, but as I took a step back, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, a whisper in my ear. It's not over. This time, the feeling was stronger. It was like I wasn't alone, but the more I read, the more uneasy I became. I returned to the cemetery that afternoon. I stopped in front of Sarah's grave, staring at the small, faded marker. There was nothing unusual about it, just a simple stone with a name etched into it. But I could feel something, a presence. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her, the woman in black. She was standing in the same spot where I had seen her before, her long hair obscuring her face. But this time, she was closer, I whispered, though I wasn't sure why. I wasn't expecting an answer. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her figure almost blending into the shadows. She was standing just a few feet away, watching me with that same eerie stillness. Her eyes were hidden, but I could feel them. I could feel her watching me, piercing through the darkness. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" Then, something changed. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and brushed the dirt away. What I uncovered sent a chill through my spine. Inside, there was a tattered black ribbon, a broken locket, and what looked like a small journal. The journal was stained and worn. The final entry was the most disturbing. It read, "The ritual was meant to bring us closer to the afterlife, to communicate with the spirits, but something went wrong." I couldn't believe it. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise behind me. The air grew thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, reaching out toward me. Driving a hearse isn't for everyone. It's one of those jobs that no one really thinks about until they have to. The moment I became a hearse driver, I was faced with a reality most people would never fully grasp. The world of the dead is far more complicated, and often far more terrifying, than the world of the living. It is not a glamorous job. No one notices you when you re behind the wheel of that black, shiny hearse, driving down quiet streets filled with families, unaware of the quiet weight you carry. But over the years, I've learned to recognize certain patterns, the one I had driven countless times before, but today it felt different. The road was empty, the usual hum of traffic absent, and the only sound I could hear was the soft purr of the hearse's engine. It was during this stretch of road that I noticed her standing at the edge of the cemetery gates, near the large oak tree. The woman was dressed in black from head to toe, her face obscured by a veil. She was motionless, just standing there, watching. I had happened just a few years ago, when I was tasked with transporting a local woman to her final resting place. Her name was Laura Hall. The air around me felt thick, almost suffocating, hoping to make sense of the strange events that had been unfolding. The usual hum of the groundskeepers and the distant murmurs of families visiting the graves were absent. The air was thick with fog, and the trees seemed to bend under the weight of the grey sky above. I parked the hearse by the entrance and walked toward the spot where I had seen the woman the day before. As I approached, I noticed something unusual. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, leading from the graveyard's entrance to the tree where I had seen her standing. I couldn't get the image of the woman in black out of my mind, and the sensation of the hearse door opening by itself kept replaying in my thoughts. What was going on? Was it just a series of odd coincidences, or was something more sinister happening? I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. I drove back to the funeral home, and the rest of the evening went as expected. But that night I couldn't sleep. It was probably a passerby, someone who was grieving or just spending time in the cemetery. But as I drove past, I felt something I hadn't expected. A chill ran through my body. I noticed something strange. The rear door of the hearse was slightly ajar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The strange woman, the loose latch, and the oppressive sense of dread that had followed me throughout the day made me uneasy. It wasn't open by much, but it was enough for me to notice. The latch had clearly been secured, but it had somehow come loose. I checked it again, double-checked the lock, and it seemed fine. I moved forward with unloading the casket, but the incident left me uneasy. The temperature inside the hearse seemed to drop, and a wave of dread washed over me. I glanced back in the rearview mirror, but the woman was gone. And as the last of the mourners left, I stayed behind to finish my checks. I walked back to the hearse to make sure everything was secured for the drive back. As I approached, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. The rear compartment door was open wide, open, as if someone had been inside. But there was no sign of anyone. The graveyard was empty. The mourners had all gone, and I was alone. It happened so quickly, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, staring at me. And she passed away suddenly from a heart attack. It could have been a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind playing games with me, but the feeling lingered. The rest of the drive was uneventful, and we arrived at the cemetery without further incident. The family gathered around the gravesite, and everything appeared as it should. She was in her late 40s, an unexpected death, which left her family shattered. The funeral was planned quickly, as it usually happens in cases like this. Her family was small, but close-knit, so they requested a modest ceremony, nothing too extravagant. Certain things that can't easily be explained. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The family was somber, but there was a sense of peace that came with the closure of the ceremony. It was a small gathering, and nothing unusual happened during the service itself. But when I started the drive to the cemetery, something eerie happened. After all, driving a hearse means spending your days around death, and death itself is unsettling. But after a while, I began to notice that not all things were as they seemed. Some things just didn't belong. One of the most memorable experiences, I arrived early at the funeral home to prepare the hearse. The air was crisp, and the clouds above made everything feel a little colder than usual. As I double-checked the rear compartment, everything seemed in order. I ran through my standard routine tires, fuel interior, and then ensured that the casket was properly secured in the back. But something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the usual calm I felt before the drive didn't settle in. The air felt heavier, charged with an unusual tension. The service went as expected. I was on my usual route. I thought I was imagining it. I dismissed it. But as I was preparing to offload the casket, the family was too caught up in their grief to notice anything out of the ordinary, and I didn't mention it to them. I finished the burial. I closed the door and locked it. but I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone had been inside. The next day, I decided to return to the cemetery. When I arrived at the cemetery, it was eerily quiet. I followed the footprints, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves covering the ground. 1913 to 1923. I knelt down. There was something about Sarah Whitaker's story that didn't sit right with me. Her death had been sudden, unexplained. No one had claimed her body, and she was buried in this forgotten part of the cemetery, hidden away from the rest of the graves. I couldn't understand why I kept feeling this pull, as if something or someone was urging me to learn more about her. Brushing away the dirt and leaves from the base of the stone. Waiting for what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Sarah Whitaker. I had heard that name before. It was on one of the old burial records I had read during my search for answers. Yes, I've been here for so long, watching, to know that I'm not just a forgotten soul, that I mattered, waiting for someone to find me, to understand. But no one came. They never came. The weight of her words settling around me like a thick fog. I realized then that the woman in black wasn't just a random figure who had wandered into the cemetery. She was something more, a spirit tied to this place, to this land, to the forgotten grave of Sarah Whitaker. The air lightened, and the oppressive coldness around me seemed to lift. Sarah's face soft, her expression no longer twisted with pain and longing. She took a step back, and for the first time since I had seen her, she looked at peace. She had died over 50 years ago, and yet, there she was, at the center of the mystery that had been haunting me. I can finally rest. Your support means everything. The prince led me to a part of the cemetery I wasn't familiar with, a section that was poorly maintained. Vanished into the mist, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind. Or gave you chills, please hit. But the memory of Sarah Whitaker's spirit haunted me. I thought about her often, about the promise I had made to remember her. Adds another layer to our growing community. And though I never saw her again, I couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes, when I drive through the cemetery at night, I can still feel her watching me, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's presence was still with me. I had promised to remember her, but as I glanced at the grave one last time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Had I truly helped her? Or had I unwittingly invited something far darker into my life? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. With overgrown grass and unkempt tombstones, my heart raced as I tried to comprehend what was happening. Why have you been following me? What do you want? The further I walked, the stronger the feeling of unease became. It was as if the air itself was growing heavier, pressing down on me. I've noticed that now, every time I drive past that cemetery, the woman in black seems to be standing at the gates, waiting for someone to remember her again. I came to a stop at an old, cracked headstone. The inscription was faded, but I could make out a few words. Sarah Whitaker. Feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. How can I help you? What do you need from me? And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare? And I knew that the woman in black, Sarah Whitaker, was not asking for something simple. She wanted something far more powerful. She wanted to be seen, to be recognized, to be acknowledged. And if I didn't help her, I feared that her spirit would never let me go. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I will be free. As I stood up, the sound of rustling leaves reached my ears, and I turned instinctively. To my horror, the woman in black was standing just a few feet away. This time, her face was fully visible. My legs were frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman in black took a step forward, and with each movement, I felt the air grow colder, heavier. It was as if her presence was pulling the warmth from the very ground beneath me. And what I saw made my blood run cold. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and lifeless, as if she hadn't blinked in years. Her skin was pale, stretched tight over her bones, and her lips were twisted into a faint smile. She was staring directly at me, her gaze fixed and unwavering. I couldn't move. Who are you? I finally managed to croak. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that sounded like a whisper from beyond the grave. I've been waiting. Her words chilled me to the bone. Waiting to be remembered, she replied, her voice low and raspy. I never got a proper goodbye. I was forgotten. I could barely breathe. You're Sarah Whitaker, I whispered. She nodded slowly, her head tilting to the side, as if she was studying me. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath in front of me, a mist forming in the space between us. I want my peace, Sarah whispered, her hollow eyes never leaving mine. I want them to remember me. I took a step back. She tilted her head again, her eerie smile growing wider. I need you to remember me. And when you do, I will finally rest. The wind picked up again, and the sound of it howling through the trees felt like a warning. My chest tightened. I nodded slowly, still trembling. I will make sure you are remembered. I will tell your story. At that moment, something changed. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Before I could respond, she disappeared. When I finally made my way back to the hearse, the days that followed were quiet. The strangest part. Thank you all for joining me on these journeys. And I love reading your reactions and personal experiences in the comments. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, that like button and consider subscribing for more haunting stories. Have you ever experienced something similar, or perhaps you have your own unexplainable story to share? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below each of your stories of horror enthusiasts. Don't forget to share this video with them. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories. And remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video of your day.